Hi, friends. I am thrilled to share Molly Lannon Kenny's interview with you today. In her interview, she shares more about the experience of supporting people in moving through their process of grief, the experience of her sister's transition, and what it would be like to live in a culture where we could talk about anything. I'm excited for you to listen to her interview. Molly has been teaching radically inclusive yoga for over 25 years. She has started countless outreach programs in a variety of settings, including end-of-life care, trauma recovery, homeless and transitional shelters, and intensive care hospital units. She has served on the boards of International Association of Yoga Therapists and Yoga Service Council, and has been published multiple times in various yoga-oriented journals and popular press, as well as publishing a book of essays about yoga and everyday life entitled No Gurus Came Knocking. Her current areas of interest are teaching bedside yoga retreats, as well as comparative spirituality and religion. She's a graduate of the Living School with Richard Rohr, and Molly lives full-time at her home in the jungles of Mexico. Enjoy the conversation. Welcome, Molly. I'm excited that you are here and that you said yes to participating in this summit, online summit about grief and liberation. And
Thanks,
I want to
Michelle.
invite us. Yeah, I'm glad you're here. It's so nice to see you and hear you.
Likewise.
Yeah, I want to invite us to begin with just a centering and grounding to arrive in this space. You're in Mexico, I'm in North Carolina, so we can center and ground. And to center, you can close your eyes or you can soften your gaze and just find a comfortable way to be in your body. And take a moment to turn your attention to your breath. Begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And now begin to deepen and lengthen your breath in your body. As you deepen and lengthen your breath, begin to notice how you feel, what's present for you in this moment, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And see if you can embrace whatever you notice, whatever is present for you, can you embrace it and be with it? And now as you breathe, just become aware of your heart space and your heartbeat. And notice what you're holding in your heart. What are you holding in your heart? What is present in your heart space? And take a few more deep rounds of breath, cycles of breath, and practice being with your heart and what is present there. And take 5 more deep breaths here. And as you're ready, you can open your eyes and take a moment to reorient to the space you're in. Okay, so thank you, Molly Lannon Kenny, for being here today. We met in Portland, Oregon in the fall of 2017. And I remember when we met, I felt like we could have just talked for a long time. I felt your warmth and your capacity to like hold anything that I was going to say. I just felt that way about you. Like I could tell you anything and you wouldn't judge it, and you'd be able to hold it and respond to it or just be with it. So I really love that about you. And we met because you were inviting me to participate in a yoga, it wasn't a yoga festival, but a yoga conference. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I participated in. And I know you also mentioned that you just are a recent graduate of the Living School, which I would love for you to talk about so people can hear more about that. Sure. You're a yoga teacher, and I want us to talk about bedside yoga because I know you've created that model and been teaching that, and created another model of yoga and way of working with people. So there's more I could say. I'm going to let you say more about the specifics of who you are, though.
Sure. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, first I felt definitely the same way when I met you. So thanks for that. I remember very well, like exactly where we were sitting. I can practically remember like what we ate at that meal, honestly, and like the way the sun was and what time it was. So it made a big impression on me. So yeah. And then getting to actually see you teach at the conference, and then other times that I've been able to follow your work, I feel a great kinship with you. Mm-hmm. So thank you. Yeah, all of those things you said are true. I opened a yoga center in 2001, and it was the first nonprofit yoga. It was like a yoga and therapy center in Seattle, Washington. It was the first nonprofit yoga center in the Northwest. And from the very beginning, out of the gate, we worked, our mission statement was to let the teachings and practices of yoga be available to all people regardless of perceived barriers. And so we were really dedicated to that idea of radical inclusion and radical accessibility from the get-go. And that center grew into really a culture and a community to the extent that even, I was just on retreat and several of my students were saying, are we in a cult? Which we're definitely not in a cult. But that feeling of like the intensity of the bond and of the value system that we share is really, really powerful, and nothing I ever could have thought would have come to fruition or would have come from my idea. I was a speech pathologist working at a hospital, and I wanted to find a different way of working with folks. And so I started this center really to create a new therapy method, and sort of on the side, I was going to be teaching yoga. And so that's how that all came together. I actually never did a real teacher training. I just learned over the years, and, I dedicate myself fully to whatever pulls my interest. The Living School is something that has been a huge part of my growth, and especially my most recent growth. The Living School is a school that comes out of the Center for Action and Contemplation, which was founded by Father Richard Rohr, who is a Franciscan priest, and who is extremely radical and teaches about what he calls the edge of the inside, or also what Mirabai Starr has called him, the keeper of the jewels. And so these are people who are willing to stay within a system because they have the capacity to stay within that system, but to critique it so unrelentingly to critique the system, and to by holding their position of power within the system. So we can even think about I don't know, I think about like when Trump got elected and people are like, well, I'm going to move out of the country. And just by the way, I had moved out of the country before that. But that idea that, okay, I don't like this, so I'm going to leave. And I totally understand where that is, but we need people who are like, no, I've got so much power in this place, I'm going to stay. And I'm just going to be, again, like unrelenting in my critique. And so that's who Richard Rohr is as a priest. So he positions himself on what he calls the edge of the inside. And the deal with the Living School in particular is reclaiming Christianity as a radical mystical tradition. And so looking at the reality of who Jesus actually was, who the cosmic Christ is, which is completely consistent with Brahman, to look at how the teachings of Jesus have been co-opted and basically subverted into a domination paradigm. And then looking at all kinds of teachers going far back as like the Desert Fathers and Mothers, then St. Teresa de Avila and John of the Cross, and then more contemporarily people like Howard Thurman. And then even right now, they just brought Barbara Holmes onto their faculty, who's a phenomenal writer and professor, and talks specifically a lot about the contemplative practices of the Black Church and how white folks tend to see like contemplative and mystic practices as being like totally like quiet, silent, inward, and how one of the aspects of the Black Church was to have contemplative practices that are loud and very communal. And so it's a phenomenal experience. The school's only been around for like 5 or 6 years, so it's growing and it's finding its way. But that has heavily influenced my work. And then I'd always been doing yoga and grief recovery, and that moved its way into yoga and end of life care. And then, and I'd been doing that for a long time, and stewarding people through the death process. Both friends, but then people I would meet in a volunteer program that I started back in, I think, like 2003. And then most recently, I lost my own sister and best friend, and shepherded her through her death, through her illness, through her death process. And then now shepherding myself through the grief process and having brand new awakenings that all the years I was teaching, which I don't want to say you can't be a fantastic teacher and a fantastic healer and presence and all that if you haven't had that experience. I don't want to say that at all, because also I'd be putting myself under the bus before. But the new openings, when it's so personal, really provide a whole other perspective. And so that was about a year ago now that she died. And so, that's where I am right now, just sort of refinding my way, Michelle, of like, sort of, who am I now? Who am I moving to Mexico? Who am I not being the leader of the Samaria Center? And, who am I without my sister? So that's where I am.
Yeah, thank you for sharing more about who you are and where you are, right, emotionally. And something I really appreciate about you is you're, from what I can see, public about grieving, like you're public about your grief process, which I think is really helpful for people, because in my experience, the culture really doesn't make space for us to talk about grief, even though everyone's grieving someone or something. And so I'm wondering why you feel like it's important, given your work, to talk about grief at this time, and if it feels like it makes sense to answer the other part of the question, which is, why is it important to talk about liberation? Because those things go together for me. Like, the process of moving through grief potentially provides more space, freedom, liberation, whatever word we want to use. So why do you feel like it's important to make space for this, to be talking about grief and liberation now at this time?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So such a great question with so much depth. So first, I would say that I'm like a professional oversharer. And I've done that because I feel like I've lived a lot of life. I mean, I guess everybody would say that for sure. But life has definitely offered me a lot of very unique experiences. And then looking at those unique experiences, especially specifically from like my place of privilege in society, and how my place informs these different experiences and my reactions to those experiences, and ways that I can help other people maybe to navigate experiences that feel so isolating and so lonely and so oftentimes shameful, or at least that's what culture has told us, that these are, you know, like, don't talk about those things. And so for a very long time I've just been like putting, if I'm not hurting another person with what I'm sharing, like if it's not too private to another person, I put it all out there, because exactly what you said, Michelle, the number of, and I have had pushback, and particularly like sharing after the death of my sister, that there was definitely some family stuff of like, you know, why are you putting that all out there? Sort of, why are you making it about you, right? And I'm like, well, because it is about me, right? Like this process is about me, and it's about so many other people. And so the number of people that come to me, whether it's this or, you know, previous things, miscarriages, whatever, being robbed, like whatever the thing is, the amount of people that say, oh my God, like, okay, I didn't know we could talk about that, or like, that was my experience. So I think that I always believe that if we could live in a world where we could just share pretty much everything, that all of us would have so much less loneliness and fear. And I feel like actually in that conversation when you and I first met, Michelle, because I was already on this tip of that if we could learn to just hang in there talking, that we could actually talk about and resolve anything. And I really believe that it's this level of like learning how to like stay there and communicate, that we could make our way through anything. So with grief, I think it's really important to talk about grief, because you're right, we are not a culture that has a lot of opportunities or structures or places where we can openly talk about grief, what our earliest grief experiences are. There's a lot of even like comparing. I just did a contemplative retreat. It happened to fall over Samhain and Day of the Dead, and so it sort of ended up being a little bit of like a bereavement, grief and loss retreat, even though that wasn't, it was just meant to be a contemplative retreat. And I will be offering again next year. And we did a lot of like witness circling and just asking people their earliest experience of grief or their earliest experience of loss. And so even, you know, someone will say, well, I've only lost a dog so far, you know, and suddenly then they'll feel like, well, that's not enough, you know, and, you know, having just lost my sister, I actually got to say in one of the circles, like, wow, the death of my sister eclipsed the death of my animals. But right, yes, like those fucking hurt, you know? So like, even those are the things that sometimes keep people from expressing their experience, because they're like, is it enough? Did I suffer enough in that? Like, was that big enough, you know? And so I think it's always important to leave space to talk about all of the things that make us feel alone. And then I think, because as you said, grief is such a universal experience, and there's no one everyone's touched by grief in some way, whether it's your cat or your dog, or you lost a job, or you're recognizing that your childhood wasn't as good as you thought it was, or whatever. But what I say to people is that irrespective of what grief you've experienced so far, you have so much grief coming down the pike to you. And what I say to people is, you are going to lose every single thing you love. Up until when you die first, everything you love is going to go away. Everything. Why are we not preparing for that? And especially in this, like, and you know, if we have time, we'll get back to it, but I'm going to put in air quotes, this spiritual practice of yoga. Like, why aren't we recognizing that there's so much to offer in this practice, or to help us to address grief and prepare for things that have not yet come? And then in terms of, so I think it's always important to talk about grief, but it's also always important to talk about liberation. And so one of the ways that we self-liberate and liberate one another is by excavating our shadow sides, right? So that we can be more fully aware of the fullness of who we are. And that the fullness of who we are includes like these phenomenal gifts that we all bring, that we all came with, that we were all sort of God given. And they also, the human experience also contains a lot of shadow and a lot of darkness and a lot of limitation and a lot of sort of the other side of things that we're not so good at and we're not so versed at. And those are the things then that we want to hide away and we want to not talk about and we want people to not know about. So if the more that we could collectively be invested in talking about everything that makes us human, the less that shadow side would have its hold, and then the less we could actually feel that sense of liberation. And then also grief and liberation, because grief is a leveling thing and liberation is also a leveling thing. And we have to know, as you always state, Michelle, that especially for people like me who are white and very enjoy so many axes of privilege, that that the shackles of anyone are the shackles of everyone, and that my liberation is complete, like or the impact, for example, from your work of white supremacy on me as a white person is equally as damning and damaging, right? Differently, but equally. And so I think that this idea of tying an awareness and some healing around our collective grief is a really intractable piece of the process of collective liberation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You brought up in what you said the spiritual practice of yoga and sort of a question of why we aren't engaging the practice to really respond to losing all the things we love, right? Before we die or before we transition. So I'm wondering if you could share some about what that looks like, because you work with people who are transitioning through bedside yoga. And I'm just curious, like, what that would look like if we actually engage the practice to be with the truth that we are going to lose everything and everyone we love, right? Up until the point of our transition.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a couple things that would come up, especially from the yoga tradition, would be looking at things like the kleshas, like understanding more clearly or linking more clearly, for example, that the first of the kleshas, or the obstacles to freedom from suffering, is that we don't recognize our connection to Brahman, or we don't recognize our connection to God. And we're cut off from that feeling of source and connectedness. And because we live that like isolated individualistic life, when it comes time for my death or someone else's death, I experience it as this very like separate event, this event that should be avoided, this thing that should be, that's like so final. And so in that's one way that if we started to really use our yoga practice as a practice first and foremost, like you do yoga teachers trainings too. You ask people what yoga means to yoke or whatever. What are you yoking to? And everybody will say body, mind, and spirit, body, mind, and spirit. And I always say, well, that's not an incorrect answer, but it's not really the response that would have been put forth by people expressing these darshanas, right? Yoga as one of the 6 orthodox philosophies of India wouldn't really have been that. It clearly is connection to a divine source, connection to Brahman, connection to God. And so if we could do more work or think of our practice more as that, and then what are the practices within yoga, whether they're asana or meditation or chanting or whatever they might be, to have the primary focus be on me, the individual truly having that experience, that would be one way that we would be better equipped for dealing with the inevitable. I think at the same time, and then there's like the Katha Upanishad, the Death as Teacher Upanishad, which is another great resource to kind of look through and figure out, so like what is that relationship to death and dying, and how do we relate to death and dying. And then at the same time, I think that the more that we really use our if we choose yoga as a primary spiritual practice, the more that we really use it to focus back on ourselves, the better we are also at being just totally present to what is. And I guess I'm trying not to say the phrase holding space, because it's kind of overused, but that's what I'm saying, right? Like, we would be so much better at that, and we would find it so much more natural if we already knew that we truly were divine presence. And so that I don't have to come in with an agenda. I don't have to come in with you like knowing who I am. I don't have to come in with an idea about how I want things to happen, or how I think things should happen. Or in my retreats, even, I tell people, if you're planning on being with people at the end of life, there's a couple questions you're going to have to be ready to address. One is like, how am I going to go on without this person? And another one is, what's going to happen next? Like, if I die, I'm the person who's dying. And how do we respond to those from a place of total presence? Because mostly the answer is like, I don't know, but you will. Right. And so how do we find the way to be there, like just totally authentically? And I think that I put the reason, I don't know if this is going to be viewed or just audio, but the reason I put it in air quotes is because largely we miss yoga as a mystic practice, as the depth of the spiritual practice and what it has to offer us is largely absent from the contemporary conventional practice of yoga, at least in the US, that I'm aware of. Yeah. And I would just add, I was just saying this to someone this morning. I have this article I say for years. One day I'll finally write it, but its title is "Yoga is Dangerous as a Spiritual Practice." And what I really mean by that is, and what I said this morning to someone, it's like someone coming to you with this like phenomenal, most delicious piece of like chocolate hand hewn coming from Sweden or something. And you're like, no, I'm good. I have this, dollar store Kit Kat that I'm eating, right? So you think you already have the thing, and so you're not open to like the real thing. And I see that happening a lot. I see it. I literally see it a lot in yoga students who they think they have a spiritual practice because they do yoga, twice a week. And to me, it really is sad. And I don't mean sad in like a passive aggressive kind of snotty presumido way. I mean, like, it's sad. Like, it makes me sad for that person, because that's not good. Like, knowing two things about ahimsa is not going to help you when your mom is in the hospital in an end of life.
Yeah. The questions you asked, that you centered, that you offer to people in your trainings or retreats about, what are you going to do without this person when they die or transition? And I mean, I think then people are asked to like think about their own death. That was kind of the second question. I'm just curious about how you would answer those questions, like how you have answered them, because you've been through the experience of grief over and over and over. And if you feel comfortable answering them, I think it could be useful for people to witness someone like lean into the practice of answering the questions that you've sent.
Yeah, totally. So for the first question, like, what am I going to do without that person? I have responded to that for kids, for adults. I mean, for all kinds of people, like, how am I going to go on? And to me, it's really being able to say, you just will. You will. I don't know what it will actually look like, but that's again part of what your idea about collective grief and collective liberation. This idea that, again, that this is such a unique experience, that no one else has had the pain that I've had, which doesn't, like, not to minimize that person's pain, but to be able to look at all these people in the world in front of you, that they lost their baby, they lost their dad, they lost their partner, they lost their dog, and there they are, right? They're changed, but they're there, they're going on, they're thriving, and you're going to too. So that's really what my answer to that is just that I don't know what it will look like, and I know that from where they're sitting right there, they can only do what they can do. They can only be and react from the person they are right in this moment, and just to be kind to whatever that incarnation is in the moment, but that yes, that there will be life after this, and it will be different, and it will also be okay. And interestingly, for me in my work, I've done a ton of bereavement work with kids, and kids generally have an easier time accepting that it's going to be different, but it's going to be okay. And so we can learn from that. I feel like they have a better witness consciousness in some ways. And then when people say, what's going to happen to me when I die? I often would say things like, I don't know, or I'd reflect back to them, what do you think is going to happen? And then based on what they say, I can say, and how does that make you feel? Right. So if they're like, well, I think I'm going to go to heaven. Okay. How does that make you feel? It makes me feel good because I'm going to see my, so-and-so. I think I'm going to be in purgatory. Okay. How does that make you feel? Right. Or I have no idea what's going to happen. How does that make you feel? And being able to attend more to that, to the feeling, than having to respond. On the other hand, I'll say that with my sister, I answered her straight. And I said, well, I'll tell you I have two thoughts on this, and you can see what works for you. I said, either my scientific mind says we just die. We're just gone, in the same way that when we go under like general anesthesia, there's no fear, there's no pain, there's no, even to use the word nothingness or void or something like that. Those come from the language that we're speaking of this plane. So they have like a scary or sort of ominous or like vacuous feel to them, right? But it would be at a different plane where those feelings wouldn't apply to those words. Like it's truly just gone. So that's one option. And then the other option, I said to my sister, is what I believe is that from love we come, and from love we shall return, right? So that we are an energy of love that has always been in existence. And then we put on this mortal coil, we wear it for a while, and then we leave and we go on to some other energy that is consistent and that feels, again, ways that we couldn't even know or put words to, because we only live this that we know. But that would be a place that would be a wonderful place to be. Different, but beautiful. So it depends on who I'm talking to, how much I want to give them my opinion, sort of, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thank you for answering the questions and sharing how you answer them, and also how you answered them when your sister asked them, right? And I'm wondering about what the greatest lesson is that you've learned from grief. And if you want to be specific about your sister, you can be, or if it's, you want to talk about some other experience of grief, that's fine. I just know from being in a relationship with you that you center her a lot, right? And she's present with you. That's how I feel. So I'm just wondering about the lesson that you've learned from the experience, because you've encountered grief a lot.
Yeah. Thanks again for your just sweetness and attentiveness. So I had always talked about the lessons of grief and the gifts of grief and all of that. And as I said earlier, I don't want to diminish anyone's experience ever. So you're always having important lessons and gifts that are coming to you that are important for exactly where you are now. And then we have new experiences, and then we get new and different lessons that are important as well. Specifically the things that I like, I'll say like a lesson and a gift. A lesson, actually two lessons. One lesson was the profound anger that I experienced that was really nonspecific. So was it like because my sister died, or was it the manner in which she died, anything like that? No, it was just nonspecific anger. And actually anger anger would be like the light term. I would really say rage. And, I shared with several friends as I've come out of it that I really felt like I was walking around like waiting for someone to say something to me so I could just like lash out, and that's not really a big part of my personality. And so that was like, I didn't even know what to do with that. I didn't know where it was coming from. I didn't know how to protect people from it. I didn't know how to differentiate like anger that was like legitimate, let's say towards a husband or a, you know, someone that I was working with. Um, I mean, legitimate versus was this actually like sort of this
Mm-hmm.
underlying. So that's something I would love to help people with more, and love to talk to people about more and sort of prepare them for more. That's such a natural piece of it. And again, and I want to just really emphasize the non-specific. So it wasn't like anger at anything that went wrong. And the other lesson I would say, not from grief, but this is specifically from death, is collateral damage, and that was a huge lesson that I'd be looking forward to helping the next person that I know that has lost someone close to them, to be able to attend to the grief around the loss of that person. But I would also have the question for them, something like, what else has changed in your family system that is now creating a lot of suffering and a lot of discomfort? And that wouldn't have been a question that I would have known to ask previously. But now when I've been able to talk about it with people, everybody has a story about how now they no longer talk to their brother, or
Mm-hmm.
the relationship with their parents is now strained, or, you know, with a stepchild or something like that. And so that really, in all my years of working with grief and death and dying, was not something I had the larger vision to ask. But I think that's an important thing. And that was a big lesson for me, is all sort of the, yeah, again, like collateral damage,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
system stuff. And then gifts, you know, a gift that back when my dog died, I moved to Seattle in 1990 with a dog, and I would have been 23 years old, and had her for the next 13 years. So that's like pretty significant, you know, time. And so when she died was my first like major death experience. And I remember starting to see some of the grief, or some of the gifts then, things like what really matters, like the speed with which we all expect people to respond to us, how much it matters if my dishes are done or not, even like friendships or places that you want to be, or that that you're used to going to, that
Mm-hmm.
suddenly you're like, yeah, I don't even feel good here. I don't even know why I go to that. Like, I've been involved in a Texas Hold'em poker game here for like the past 5 years, and I just went the other night, and I was just sitting at the table, and I just went all in. I was like, I don't know, something has switched in me. Like, I see things so much more clearly, and I don't feel good here. I don't want to be here anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are gifts. And I think there's like this acuteness that sometimes, and this is a surprise to a lot of people, that those of us who have been in intense bereavement, that there are even moments that we want to be there again, even though it's so painful. It's
Mm-hmm.
so exquisite in a way, that there's sometimes these moments that I'm like, I want to feel that profundity again. I want to feel that amount again. Um, and then another gift really from my sister is more of that, like more of the clarity and the boundary setting, and just sort of, you know, really looking at like, who do we want to be in the world. And then something that a friend just wrote to me recently, a fellow teacher, Tracy Hodgman, wrote, that when people die, they, like, when you love them, that you inherit certain of their qualities. And so maybe you inherit their courage, or you inherit their capacity for speaking up, or you inherit their softness, or something like that. And so that was another sort of surprise gift, I guess I would say, is being able to use that way of thinking, and look at the things that I've inherited from my sister through her dying.
Mm-hmm. That is beautiful.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I appreciate everything you said. And one thing that struck me is what you named about sometimes wanting to go back to that place of despair or sorrow or whatever emotion or sensations arising, like as we're moving through the grief, wanting to revisit that. And it made me think about when I moved to Portland. I think it was right before I met you, my dad passed away 11 days after I arrived there, which made it really hard to land there. And I remember being in the grocery store a day after he passed away and wanting people to like talk to me about how I was feeling, or wanting to tell everybody my dad just died. And I revisit that moment in my head a lot because I think I wanted people to like stop everything and be like, something's going on. We don't know what. I wanted people to see that. And so I just appreciate the naming of like, sometimes we do want to go back to that experience. And for me, it's because people slow down. Like I slow down in those moments enough to feel the gravity of what's happened. And I actually want people to do that with me. And I
Right.
think grief provides that. It can create this container where we have to slow down, right? We have to
Right.
feel, because we aren't in control of that process of grief, right? It's just moving through. We're wading through it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it reminds me then too, again, like another gift, and it's almost like it's almost sounds trite what I'm about to say, but maybe we can bring it back with maturity, is that I felt the same way, Michelle. I just wanted to wear a sign that was like, can you just be tender with me? Like, I don't have it all together right now, and and sometimes I would just say, my sister just died, or my sister's dying, right? Because I was
Mm-hmm.
caregiving for her. But what it brings back is that capacity, I think, also for us to remember that every single person is walking around with a load that we have no
Mm-hmm.
idea what they're carrying. And again, like, it's all these like sort of yoga quote memes, that we see, and we want to like repost them on Instagram. Like, that's a good one. And like, it's a great sentiment for sure. But I'd love like to take a moment to like revisit it, not just as a meme, but like as a
Right.
reality, that like, in the same way, like you're wanting the cashier to look at you and be like, oh my God, you just went through this thing, or you're going through this thing. The cashier is,
Right.
likely in the same boat.
Mm-hmm. That's
Right.
right.
And so they're being short with you, or they can't, do the calculation in their head, or whatever the thing is. And, it's so easy for us to get back and like, God, that person, what a jerk, or they should have acted this way, or, whatever. And just been like, I have no idea. I have no idea why they acted that way.
Mhm. That's right.
Yeah.
And important to remember, we don't know what people are carrying with them, right, and moving with. And
Mm-hmm.
a practice sounds like we can assume that people are carrying something, right, that's heavy or feels unbearable or intolerable, or, they aren't sure what to do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That is the practice, right? And I often will say that as a therapist. I'll say to people, you can tell me as much or as little as you want, because I already know some certain things about you. You
Mm-hmm.
know, like,
Mm-hmm.
I know you have weird private behaviors that you do at home. I know that you probably have a complicated relationship with food. Like, I can name all these things.
Right.
They're like, how do you know that? And I was like, because it's the human experience. Because it's
Right.
the human experience. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, Given what we were just talking about with this idea that everyone's carrying something and we don't know, and just these universal experiences we have because we're in bodies at this time, I'm wondering what you think it would look like for culture, and maybe the question is really on a collective level, for us to make space for grief and resilience or liberation of joy, whatever word you want to use, one of those or a different word. Like, what would that look like to prioritize spaces for us to grieve collectively, and also to remember, I don't want to say the opposite of grief because I don't know what that is, but remember our resilience too, I think is what I want to offer. What might that look like?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm getting this image in my head right now, actually, that I said a bunch of. I was just up in Seattle teaching, and I mentioned this several times because I got to hang out with a really good friend who had just left a relationship, and he was processing a lot of grief around that. And he took me out to coffee, and then we're getting the coffee, and he goes, I just, sometimes feel like I could just like cry at any moment. And I was like, well, that's okay. And
Mm-hmm.
next thing I know, and this is like a white man, is like just in the middle of like a coffee shop, is just like not weeping, like like racked sobbing. And he's like, oh, I'm sorry. And we just sat down, and I was like, just keep going, keep it
Mm-hmm.
going. And we talked about it later, and I talked about it with my students. Like, what if we saw people crying more? Right? Like, so in a very real practical thing, like we start to cry and we go into the bathroom, we feel like we're going to cry and we hold it until we get home, um, and I just wonder about that, if like literally making space in that way, and then letting some of us, like maybe who have more agency or more fearless or whatever it might be, like that we're also the models of that, right? And I'm not talking about just like crying over every little thing. I'm not talking about white tears. I'm talking about like that, like profound, like despairing kind of grief, like true grief. What would it look like, or that's what it would look like if we didn't hide that every time we thought that that was going to be the situation, right? That we allowed ourselves or other people to cry, right? Or so, you know, even, and I'm sure you have too, like these conversations often take places out in public. You know, you're meeting a friend for dinner, you know, after your dad died or something, and next thing you know, you're crying at the table, and you know, there's this kind of, maybe someone reaches across and they hold your hand and there's sort of this surreptitious like looking around, you know, and instead like, well, all right, like just cry, you know. So I think there's that. I think that there really is like seeing more people crying, because crying is the outward, like that's the thing we see, right? So it's the outward act. So I think just that, like in a very public kind of way, would actually be really helpful. And then I also think creating particular places where people could just have these conversations. And like I said, you know, I run retreats that are about bedside yoga or grief and loss. But as I was saying, this other one was just a contemplative retreat, supposedly. Right. And then all of a sudden this came up, and I started to think, and actually the whole group was like, okay, you know, it's on the calendar for next year. And I just know that next year we're going to talk about the same thing. So I would say creating spaces that don't have to be dedicated spaces, like they're not grief retreats, because I've been doing this now for almost 20 years. And the only people that are going to come to grief retreats or right now, or bedside yoga retreats, are people that think like, I'm in bereavement, or I'm working with it, or I'm, you know, do this bedside yoga stuff, instead of what you're talking about. It, like, this is a common experience for everybody. So these circles and these opportunities to talk with skilled facilitators like you should happen in like almost any retreat. Like, it's part of a teacher training, it's part of, you know, a mindfulness retreat or whatever, that there's always some space where we're talking about grief and loss, right? You see what I'm saying? Yeah. That's not just grief and loss retreats,
right?
Because they're conversations everyone needs to be having all the time. And I would say that because we are better, we've been conditioned to be better at talking about things like resiliency and joy. I would say that starting with having those conversations be part of other spaces would then lead into the practices of resiliency or experiences of resiliency. Or even, you know, people talking about, my first experiences, I lost my dad. I mean, this was someone just on my retreat. I lost my dad at 9, and I never really talk about it, she said, because it's like, it's so old, you know, that it's like not part of my story anymore. And yet it, like, once we were talking about it, it was like, it's a massive part of her story. And out of that story, like, how did you become you following the death of your dad dying at 9, right? So the story, it follows naturally to talk about the resiliency if we open up the space to talk about grief and loss.
I love that. It occurred to me as what you just said occurred to me as you were answering the question, like the resilience comes through the process of making space for us to cry and for that to be public and people to see that, because it gives them permission to grieve, right? And to witness that and just sit with, what does it mean when I cry in public and I'm uncomfortable with that, right? And having this be part of any retreat instead of a grief retreat, right? That it's normalized, this conversation, because this is an experience everyone's having, that's how we build this muscle of resilience, right? Through the process of engaging with what's real, which is each one of us is grieving. Like, that's the deal, right? And the work, I think about this with the anti-racism work that I do, it is grief work. Like, I'm just unearthing things and making space for people to talk about things that feel uncomfortable or reckon with things. That's grief work. Jasper's joined us for the end of the interview.
I love her.
Speaking of grief, he's like the best medicine and salve for me when I'm feeling down.
I
Yeah, so
sometimes, honestly, Michelle, I think about how old is Jasper?
he's 5.5.
Okay, he's nice and young. Because honestly, when I see someone like you with a dog like Jasper, I think of like, oh, my heart
Yes,
when that dog goes, right? Yeah.
I know. I know. I feel
How
you.
my brain works.
I know. Yes, I've had dogs forever, and there's something very special about Jasper, that I know I will feel it more deeply because he's seen me through so many
Right,
things.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So I want to ask one more question and then invite you to share anything about what's going on for you as far as the retreats you're offering. The summit's going to launch the end of January, so if there's stuff coming up after that that you
Mm-hmm.
want to share, that'd be great. I'm wondering about what we were talking about, culture making space or prioritizing space for people to grieve and ways that we could practice that. And I'm wondering for you personally, what rituals do you engage in, um, or engage to support you moving through grief, which, as we just named, allows us to remember our resilience, right? The process of grieving. So, can you just share some about practices or rituals that you engage to wade through
Yeah.
life and grief?
Yes, I will. Absolutely. So let's see. The first thing is I like you, I think one of the reasons that we are connected is I'm very attuned to ritual. And I am just like, I believe that ritual is one of the most important and healing acts that we can do. And it's one of those things that, depending on your culture and your family experience and all of that kind of stuff, you might feel like you have no connection to, or you don't know how to make a good one, or something like that. And so thinking about what ritual could be is something that I talk and teach a lot about, so that people have that at the ready. So
Mhm.
um, definitely, things like uh, marking physical spaces,
Mhm.
making physical drawings, doing things like burning fires. Or on my last contemplative retreat, we are on this beautiful retreat center in the mountains of Eastern Washington, and I gave everybody marigolds, and I asked them to go out along the property and make altars, only using natural found things, all around the property, but they just to incorporate the marigold, so that we would be able to like spot these
Mhm.
altars. And that was incredible. And then we actually went around and looked at people's altars, and people would tell us like about their altars. And so I think any kinds of ritual practices are really important. And even depending on what your again, what your context is, maybe you already do, like, I don't know, Bible study or something, then maybe like have that, like you're still doing your same Bible study, but maybe doing something that's just like a little bit different. Like maybe you light a candle and then you just do your Bible study for 5 minutes, or maybe, you choose to do like a Lectio Divina or a centering prayer around your Bible study. So irrespective of like what your spiritual practices or your religious practices or what you're comfortable with, you can bring this idea of ritual in, and it, as you know, I mean, it will help. Like
Mhm.
it will help.
Mhm.
But I feel like the most important thing that I could share here as we're closing up I think we're closing up our interview, and something that I'm actually going to be writing about for my next newsletter is, um, there's a line in the Gita that talks about something that he was like, who's like new at yoga or something. I can't think of the exact word. Practice is the means, but one established in yoga, repose is the means, right?
Mhm.
And I have had so many people, and then myself, that are they have some kind of a practice, and then when something like this happens, like let's talk about like a death of a loved one, because that's probably the biggest one for most of us, they try to return to their practice. So they get out their meditation cushion, or they get out their yoga mat, or they get out their, like, whatever. And all of a sudden they're like, they don't feel like doing it, or it feels stupid, or they feel like they're like just going through the motions. And people will talk to me about that. And what I've learned, and I really stand by, is that is not the time to do your practice. That is the time to benefit from your practice.
Mm-hmm.
If sitting on the cushion true like actually makes you feel better, then like, yes, I'm not saying don't do it. But what I'm saying is that if at that moment all the practices that you had been relying on feel like they're not working, it's because they're not meant for this
Mm-hmm.
moment. They're
Mm-hmm.
meant to prepare us for this moment. And
Mm.
so in this moment, maybe what we need to be doing is lying down on the floor with our arms and legs open, staring at a spinning fan for hours. Maybe that's our practice, right? And
Mhm.
so being able to really deeply understand that, for people who are grieving, I would say that in the same way, like it's not the time to answer all your emails. Like I
Right.
actually just said that to someone who just lost their mom. I said, well, here's one thing. Now you get to like invite people out to dinner, or they invite you more likely. You get to
Hmm.
accept the invitation and then 5 minutes before cancel. You
Right.
get to be at the dinner and 10 minutes later be like, actually, I don't want to be here anymore. Like you have this window of time where like you don't have to do anything. And so I guess in some ways it's the same
Mm.
thing of like when our practices become obligatory to us, then we're doing just what Paramhansa Yoga Nanda admonished us against, right? Which is mistaking the technique for the goal. Like we're
Mm.
going back trying to do the technique. Like don't worry about the technique. Now benefit from from the technique. So I guess what I'd say like to everybody in closing is like do these contemplative practices now, and if I can be so bold as to say rolling out your mat for 45 minutes like twice a week, like that is not, that could be a contemplative practice, but that
Mhm.
is not going to make you contemplative. So
Mhm.
what are the things that we can bring into our life for real that are
Mhm.
profound and dedicated contemplative practices that will prepare us for these moments so that we can move through them with grace and ease and with some aspect of repose, some aspect of just just resting.
Mhm. That feels like such a gift, what you just shared, because the culture wants us to speed up, in my experience, instead of
Yeah.
look at the ceiling fan, right, for an hour or two, and that people can feel compelled to engage in the practice, but they're just going through the motions, as you said, not feeling anything, right? And I love the idea of, okay, this is the time to benefit. Like, this is what you've been
Right.
preparing for. This is the
Right.
spiritual practice, right? You've been engaged in, and you've been preparing for this particular moment. And so now be in the moment instead of
Yeah.
going through the motions. So I just
Right.
thank you for that
Yeah.
gift, because it feels like such a
Yeah.
gift to me, and I also feel like it will benefit so many people that listen to this and watch it, because that's
It's
such a
huge.
counter cultural message when I think about dominant culture and the messages I've gotten about grief, or yeah.
Absolutely.
So
And especially in our yoga world. I mean, I hear it
yes.
said, like, especially by yoga practitioners. I know I should be like doing my practice. I know I should be meditating. And I'm like, says who? Says
Right.
who?
Right.
No. And again, like allowing people like, it's not just, it's not just like letting you off the hook. It's actually truly saying like, no, like you spent all this time making the cake. Now just
Hmm.
eat the cake.
That's right.
That's all you have to do now,
I
right?
love
There's
that.
no more preparation.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's beautiful, and a sweet way to close our time together.
Thanks,
um,
Michelle.
Yeah, I want to know if there are any things coming up next year that you want to share about, and of course, we'll include your website and information and ways for people to connect with you in the notes and in the interview. But anything you want to share
Awesome.
about what's coming up?
Um, sure. I only have 4 things a year, so I can mention them. So I'll be the contemplative retreat. No, excuse me, the bedside yoga retreat. I'll offer twice next year. Once in April, it will be in Eastern Washington, and once in it'll be down in December. It'll be here in Mexico, where I live. And I am just going to put this out here too. It came to my attention recently in something I attended where a couple or 4 Black women were talking specifically about how their experience of grief can be very different than dominant culture grief, because dominant culture tends to be able to go straight to grief. Black folks specifically oftentimes have to first go to anger about whether, like, what happened and why. And was it the failing of a medical system that is constructed against folks of color? Is it a police system that is constructed against folks of color? So I'm saying this because of your work and your networks, but I would like to work hard this year on some scholarship opportunities. I try to price things really low anyway in terms of my tuition, but I'd love to look at some scholarships to be able to have some specifically Black people coming to retreat, and not, out of like financial need specifically, but out of whatever I can do for invitation to allow those voices to be centered, and also to have people to have the access to this, and both the retreat experience and the information. So there's that. Then the contemplative retreat that I was talking about, I will give that again next October, and that's just phenomenal. And then finally, earlier this morning, I had a phone call with a friend who I just met. She came on my last bedside yoga retreat, and she's a hospice nurse, and we're working at putting together a weekend conference called Death Matters, which is, we'll have 3 tracks. It will be the spiritual, personal, the legal, and the practical. And so we're looking at doing that in May. So that won't be so much of like a soft retreat. I mean, I hope it will be anyway. It'll be definitely more like for lay people and information oriented. So that's what I got.
It's exciting. So many important, necessary, good things happening.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for being you, and for all the wisdom that you bring forth. And thank you for centering grief in the way you are, which I think is a gift for us all. So I love you, and it's been such an honor to be in conversation and connection with you. Thank you.
Yeah.